Hello, and greetings from Singapore. This is probably the most ironic moment in all of human history to be talking about the next great migration. Mankind has just done something we never thought we could do in response to something we hoped would never happen. What did we do? We managed to seal almost all international borders, to lock down the world population at its peak. We did it, but it's been very painful. In fact, if you look at December 2019, we had reached record levels of international mobility. 1.5 billion people, tourists, students, business travelers, had crossed international boundaries. 275 million people living outside of their country of origin. And then it all stopped. It didn't just stop, it reversed to some degree. So in fact, right now, we are in the middle of what you might call a great reset. Why would a new great migration follow such an unprecedented reset? First reason is because you do not get to pick your crisis. Sadly, you may remember actually, around February of this year, people said, well, COVID seems to be the cure for climate change. The skies have cleared in so many parts of the world. Well, sadly, if we go back to some of those same places, business as usual has returned. So we are in a world of COVID, of climate change, of economic crisis, and of other natural disasters, political unrest, and so on at the same time. You do not get to pick your crisis. What all of these dilemmas, challenges that humanity faces all have in common is that they historically are major drivers of migration. Why do people move historically? And we know the answer. We have about 75,000 years of history of people moving and migrating. And the reasons are many. It can be, indeed, response to labor shortages, filling the demographic vacuum in some places. Climate change has been a factor many times. Just think about ice ages. Political unrest, civil wars and conflicts, pandemics, moving from red zones to green zones. There are many reasons why people move, and the truth is that right now, all of them are in full effect. And so we have this pent-up demand for people to move. The question is, where are they going from? Where are they going to? Now, as I said, all of these forces that drive migration are happening at the same time, and it's very hard to predict how they're going to interact with each other. We have these economic crises and volatility, sovereign debt, banking crises, protectionism, economic inequality. We have the environmental challenges that relate to climate change, rising sea levels, food scarcity, and so forth. Technological disruptions like labor automation. These also are forces that push people away from where they live to somewhere else. And of course, geopolitics, an ever-present risk. State failure and collapse, to take just an obvious example that we've seen repeatedly in the last decades. And the truth is that, again, you don't get to pick just one bucket of crisis to focus on one at a time. They're all happening at the same time, and they're leading to a world that is highly unpredictable and volatile. And so the next great human migration may be the result of many of the smaller or episodes of migration that are to come, resulting from any or all of these situations. So it's easy for people to say today, well, the solution is let's just move to the suburbs, right? Get out of cities, leave the overcrowded areas and your cramped apartments because of COVID and lockdown and work from home, and it's all so stressful. But that's not really the way people think in the long term, because of course we are very much an urban species. If you can say just a couple of things to generalize about the human population over thousands of years, it's that we have an urge to cluster into cities. And we have an urge and a desire to stay connected to each other physically as well as digitally. But let's take this very seriously, because there are cities in coastal areas or that are suffering from drought or other conditions around the world that people may need to abandon, may need to leave. And there are opportunities to regenerate populations or to increase our concentration in more stable or fertile areas. And indeed, there are digital technologies present that make it possible for us to work, depending on what industry you're in, from anywhere in the world. So some of the data does point to an increase now of people moving into rural, suburban, ex-urban areas. Some of the robotic technologies like drone delivery and delivery bots that can make life very convenient in suburban areas. There is something to be said for that. But it's not necessarily for everyone. And those suburbs may indeed become the next second-tier and first-tier cities of the future. A lot of times, especially this year, you hear people saying COVID could be the death of the city. And I say, well, do you mean the map of today's leading cities is frozen in time, and the leading cities of today were the same ones from 2,000 years ago and 1,000 years ago and 500 years ago? Because the truth is that urbanization and the patterns of human migration have always been shifting the balance of power and the economic weight among many different cities. And yes, indeed, some cities will be losers from COVID, but there are new winners as well. So it's not about the death of the city. It's about which cities are getting the post-COVID world right, and also planning to cope with climate change and migratory populations and other stresses at the same time. Fortunately, we have built up the knowledge to help cities prepare for the future and to cope with these kinds of disruptions and challenges. One thing we know for sure, if there is one common priority for mankind, and we are an urban species after all, it is sustainable urbanization. And what has become apparent in recent decades is that we're not spending enough on some of the key foundations of urban sustainability, whether that is bringing down the energy consumed and the emissions generated from our heating and cooling and our transportation, or it could be more social factors like having adequate health care and adequate affordable housing. These are some of the things that we know cities need to do to continue to attract and replenish their populations and be attractive to the next generation. But many cities aren't yet doing it, but we know we can. We know that buildings can be green. We know that people can be cycling and walking and have more walkable communities. A lot of those changes are now starting to accelerate because of COVID. So it's a real example of learning. You're hearing more and more, of course, about 15-minute cities or neighborhoods. And that, while there was the seeds of that and some efforts around that in the last several years, now those will accelerate. So can we turn crisis into opportunity? Can more cities of the world become the sustainable cities of the future? There's no question that that is our leading priority. And let's remember that the money is there to make this happen. The liquidity is there. Suddenly, the world's debt stock has ballooned yet again, the way it did after the financial crisis. Let's ask ourselves in every such situation, are we deploying this capital the way we should? Are we doing it in a way that empowers people, that retrofits infrastructure, that creates good jobs, and that makes our habitats more sustainable? Because those are binary choices, yes and no. For every dollar we spend, let's make sure we're doing it in a way that promotes sustainable habitats, especially our cities. Now, as I said at the beginning, you don't get to choose your crisis. Mankind is on the move. Right now, what you see on the upper left map, that is the distribution of the entire human population, 8+ billion people. Every one of us is actually a pixel on that map. You can see where we are geographically concentrated. So, of course, most of the world population is Asian. You can see much of the population is concentrated in coastal areas. Now, I want you to think about the impact of the image on the bottom right. That is a scenario of where the global organic food production supply is going to come from if world temperatures rise up to 4 degrees from the United Nations IPCC baseline year, which is 1990. Now, many people believe that we're going to inevitably reach the 2-degree mark and possibly higher. And we know that drought is afflicting many parts of the world. The world's largest food-producing countries today are the United States, Brazil, Australia, India, China, and a couple of others. But what about, look at this map. Where is the food going to come from if world temperatures continue to rise? It could be that the Arctic Circle is a large geography of food production, the largest, whereas, of course, again, today's world population is concentrated almost entirely south of everything that is in green on this map. So the fact is, we have to come to terms with a world, with a future, in which we have to resort ourselves and realign our geographies. The human geography of where we're located, the political geography of our borders, the economic geography of cities, all of these are out of sync with each other. The solution is not, of course, that everyone suddenly moves to the northern hemisphere, to the far north, to Canada, to Russia, and so forth. That's not practical. That's not what's going to happen. But this is an illustration of just how, again, out of sync our different layers of geography are, and how we need to think about making our habitats more sustainable, more livable for the large population we have today. As I said before, we have tens of thousands of years of history of migration from north to south, east to west, in all directions. But ultimately, the two great trends have been that we need to live near bodies of water, we need fresh water supply, and we tend to concentrate in cities. Now, I also mentioned this, the motivations for why people move, such as demographic imbalances, political unrest, economic crises, automation, climate change, the pandemic. Now let's start to talk about what we're looking for. If we could start today again and build cities from scratch, right, what would be the key elements? What is sustainable urbanization, the term I used earlier? What does it look like in reality? Well, people are looking for adequate food supplies. They're looking for sustainability in terms of the environment. They're looking for fresh water supply, for circularity in the economy of goods and the usage of materials, healthcare being adequate, universal, jobs, of course, friendliness and openness to migrants, and affordability. These are just some of the basics that we have to get right in all of our cities in order to have them be sustainable and livable. Now, who is the primary driver of the future waves of migration, and perhaps one of the geographies where we most need to adapt and deploy the lessons that we may have learned from cities elsewhere in the world around sustainable urbanization? It's certainly Asia. Inside this rectangle, you have more than 5 billion people. The majority of the human population lives here on this map. And interestingly, that's always going to be true. It's not just true today, it will be true for our lifetime and our children's lifetimes, because actually the world population is starting to plateau. It may peak at roughly 9 to 9.5 billion people over the next 20 to 30 years. So whether it is Asians staying in Asia or Asians on the move to cities around the world, coming to a city near you, to your city, the fact is that this geography really matters as a locus of the need to adapt sustainability practices from all over the world, and whether or not we get that right, Asians increasing their presence around the world. And we have to think also about then the global supply chain dimension of these cities. Now, what we have right now is a world where cities have not adequately factored in the economic cost of their activity, the environmental externalities of their activity. There's a lot of efforts in the financial markets like ESG to quantify, if you will, to use full cycle accounting, life cycle analysis to understand exactly just how costly our global supply chain reach is. And just as significant as any of that corporate activity is the locus of the populations who use those and consume those resources and buy those products from those companies that are, of course, our cities and our populations in cities. So the truth is that even if you live in one city and you have self-sufficiency internally, or you're able to access any goods and services you want at any given time, remember that those all came from somewhere. And the next step in reconciling whatever geography we put ourselves in with the resources that of the places that they come from is to think much more holistically about our distribution around the world and about the balance, having a harmonious balance, if you will, between cities and resource-rich areas. That's why ever more economists are starting to try to quantify this. One estimate suggests that the natural capital of the world, the resources that we leverage to have our comfortable urban lives, actually drive or are the foundation of half of the global economy, half of global GDP. It's efforts like this that are actually being combined with data science and satellite imagery and mapping that will really help us to understand just how connected we are to our ecology and just what a heavy footprint our urban life has if it's not reconstituted and transformed in a sustainable manner. What are some of the ways we might go about doing this? Technology is going to play a critical role there as well. Now, you may have noticed that during the pandemic, even though 2019 had been a year of ample harvests around the world, because borders were closed, food supplies, food trade were restricted. Whether it was potatoes in one country or wheat in another country, seeds in another, oils, these things were cut off from being delivered. Food was wasted, right? Because we didn't have the mechanisms to safely transport these volumes of food around the world. So many countries are now realizing that they need to accelerate their plans to rethink their spatial organization, their investments, to invest more in having localized food production and supply. This can be a good thing if it's done sustainably. This may mean that certain land that's been used to build up cities needs to be given back and needs to be turned into farmland so that we can be more self-sufficient in producing food locally. Technology can play a role because we have been doing a lot of work in the last 10 years or so with hydroponic and aquaponic food production. Countries like Singapore have been accelerating their plans to produce more food locally. And this is a trend that's going to spread all over the world. This can show that in the future we can have more localized and self-sufficient urban communities that don't consume as much water as industrial agriculture, but can still produce a growing share of the food that their communities require and consume, but can potentially do so in a way in which all of the greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with transporting food supply all over the world are spared and are reduced. There are many examples of that. So the cities of the future could have this dense footprint, be built in areas that are safe from rising sea levels, can be more circular in terms of their consumption of energy and of water supplies, grow more of their own local food. They can also recycle more, the circular economy, again, of materials, but also for the usage of water, for example, treating wastewater and reusing it for agriculture and so forth. Renewable energy and other investments should all be the top priorities to achieve this goal of sustainable urbanization around the world. And as I've been emphasizing throughout, we know how to do this. There are innovative cities for every category of investment, for every measure, for every policy that needs to be undertaken. There is a global process of learning underway. I call that Diplomacity. What does that mean? Well, actually, the history of diplomacy goes back about 4,000 years to the trading, to the commercial and cultural networks between the city-states of ancient Mesopotamia. So today we think of diplomacy as that which federal governments do with each other, but much of the history of diplomacy is cities actually transacting with each other. And today, again, with most of the world population being urban, with cities being the progressive engines of governance, with cities being the drivers of economies, we have seen the growing power of mayors and the progressive policies at the municipal level being shared around the world. Today, there are about 250 intercity learning networks in the world. That's actually more than the number of intergovernmental organizations that exist in the world today. So Diplomacity has made a very big comeback. And sustainable urbanization is the critical set of lessons that cities are now sharing with each other. The C40 is obviously one of the most prominent examples of that. And over time, we will find that even though we live in a world of more borders than ever in history, right? More countries, more nations, more sovereignty than ever, we also have more cities that are connected to each other, whether it is through stock exchanges, internet cables, or airline routes, than ever before as well. And that's where the action is when it comes to pioneering a world that is more sustainable. Cities that are getting it right, sharing their lessons, sharing their technologies, sharing their best practices with each other. So I'm hopeful that even though we live in a world of constant crisis and many unfolding crises, our networks can move faster, we can be smarter, and we can indeed achieve that goal of sustainable urbanization. And the next great migration that is set to unfold is going to be one that's hopefully going to be a peaceful one and not a chaotic scramble, the way managing this global COVID lockdown has been. So let's learn the lessons from each other, let's get it right, and let's build a sustainable world for everyone, no matter which city you live in. Thank you.
Hello, I'm delighted to be here with Parag Khanna, best-selling author and futurist. And what a time we are in to be talking about the future. So thank you, Parag, for that wonderful presentation. As always, it was very, very interesting, compelling, and I'd love to kick off with one of the things that you said right up front. You talked about converging volatilities. You talked about risk, given the times we're living in and the way you see the world from a systems perspective, chaos theory. Are you able to see something that actually stabilizes things, or is it all getting more and more volatile?
It's a great question. It's probably the hardest question in a way to grapple with is, can we get the post-COVID transition right? We have this opportunity to not repeat the mistakes of the past and to not repeat certain historical cycles. And I don't know. Right now, the answer is we're just not sure. Because one thing we can perhaps say with more certainty is that the world is regionalizing very much, and this was actually happening prior to COVID. There has been this drift, I call it sort of continental drift, regional drift, a North American system. And remember that because of the trade war and so forth, the US trades more with Mexico and trades more with Canada than it does with China, right? So there is a North American Union, even though Trump or whomever, actually no American president would use that term, but the fact is that's kind of what's happening anyway. Then you have a European system as well, right? And that's the most institutionalized, obviously. Most of Europe's trade is internal and so on. And now you have the makings of an Asian system. Remember, most Asians travel within Asia, and to the extent they cross borders, they're remaining in Asia. So I think of the world certainly as moving into these three systems. So the challenge at a high level becomes not sort of global, because we know it's so hard to shape global governance, right? But can the North American system be more sustainable, the European system, the Asian system? And that makes the question a bit more tangible. And it's not a race between them either. As I was emphasizing, it's about learning lessons between them. One of the most interesting things that's happening in Asia that people don't necessarily pay as much attention to is the learning from Europe. Because Europe leads in sustainable cities. You've got European technologies that are coming in here, European firms that are really helping, architects, designers, and so forth, helping transform Asian cities to be more sustainable the way European cities are. So that's one example of how, even if you have this continental drift, you also have this learning effect. But ultimately, the world's going to be, as a whole, a more sustainable place if these three regions get that trajectory right.
Thank you. That's a great framework, actually. So if you think of a meta system, three great regional blocks, let's say, if we just sort of take it a level further down, maybe, where do you see cities fitting into that picture? Are they at the micro or at the meso level? How do cities fit into this picture, and where do you see the great cities of over the next few decades emerging from?
Well, everywhere in the world, the urban population has been rising, right, as a share of the national or regional population. And then when it comes to cities, the scale of cities, of course, differs, because the largest cities in the West, such as New York, Los Angeles, or London, have populations roughly around 10 million or so people. But as you know, the urban clusters of Asia can be anywhere from 20 to 40, 50 million people. So cities are obviously extremely prominent. Let's remember that if you think about China, and we're looking back at 40 years since Shenzhen was designated as China's original special economic zone, 1979, 1980. Since that time, it's really begun to fuse in a way with Hong Kong. Politically, we know that that's a challenging dynamic. but even infrastructurally and economically. So the Greater Bay Area, as it's now known, what used to be the Pearl River Delta, the Greater Bay Area, as an administrative designation, is now larger than Tokyo. And I think you and I grew up in a world where we thought Tokyo is the largest city in the world, but Tokyo is actually shrinking by population, mirroring what's happening in the rest of Japan. So, again, cities universally play such a key economic role, but I just want to emphasize again that it's the answer to your question really is which cities, right? It's not fixed or static. Right now, the American population is going through this great resorting again. People have been moving away from the Rust Belt towards the Sun Belt. Now people are moving away from the coasts, inland, south to north, and so on, or north to south, but maybe in the next phase, given climate change, from south to north again. So actually, it's people's movement within cities that is, or between cities, that is so revealing about what's happening in each region, so to speak.
This is a great way to think about it, a resorting of people all around the world. I've heard anecdotally, because of the pandemic, we are certainly seeing a movement back to smaller cities from large metropolitan areas, whether it's New York or Mumbai. And I almost wonder if there is a case to be made for smaller cities. You did talk about, I think, provocatively about the return to suburbia, but I almost wonder, is there a business case? I know you talked about several factors, technology, et cetera, but what is your view on smaller cities? Is the next 15 to 20% of urbanization likely to be in smaller cities? And if so, how do you imagine them?
We could potentially put a percentage on it, something like that. That doesn't seem, far-fetched. And it's definitely something that prior to COVID, or let's say prior to the last 5 years, would have been more anecdotal, and now you can actually see it as more of a structural change. And it is certainly happening in all of the major regions. So we've talked about the North American examples for sure. And again, it's pre-COVID, it's pre-Trump, it's really just an organic thing because it has to do with price to a large degree and also just economic development. So, the Austin, Texas kinds of places, Pittsburgh and, Denver, Colorado, these places have been thriving and growing, right? Seattle, Washington has become a fast-growing metro area. Now it's one of the fastest-growing cities in the U.S. In Europe, second-tier cities have really been gaining popularity, or rather mid-sized cities, amongst the young, right? Moving away, they feel priced out of very expensive capital cities, and they have been moving towards the college towns, the university towns, and staying there. And they're more affordable and have a wonderful quality of life. And those cities have also done a good job of marketing themselves to attract young Europeans. And in Asia, too, there's been a little bit of that. So in China, for example, you've seen young people moving out of Beijing and Shanghai and going to Kunming and Yunnan province, places like this. It's been happening. So, you could say there's evidence or examples of it around the world. Again, I don't know if it's going to wind up being the next 10%, the next 15% of the urban population moving to those kinds of places. That will depend on many, many factors, really, economic, political, climate, and so on.
Let me stay on that because I'm curious about our own region. We're in Singapore. Obviously, this is a very popular hub, whether for short term or the long term. And I think I noticed that there's a bit of a trend where people love some of the surrounding region as well. I mean, there's Bali, for example, which we know is as much of an expat hub as Bangkok in a sense. People with the gig economy are starting to look at maybe a long-term plan to stay in these locations. So is there, do you think, learning, given that it's getting democratized as well, is there a trend that you think will take root and cities will start to think of themselves almost as learning hubs and starting to attract people differently? Are universities and schools going to be drivers for people to go and live in particular places?
Trends are pulling us sometimes in opposite directions because now with online learning thriving, and certainly we will get it right better than in the sort of haphazard COVID sort of way. So that on the one hand, it means you could live anywhere and study and learn and have it be more cost effective. On the other hand, there is that gravity, that appeal, that community element of being on a campus, with other students, and ideally that campus being in a living lab, in a city, in a great city like Singapore, or places like that. When it comes to young professionals, though, I think as you're alluding to, Again, we've seen this for some years now. Young people, millennials, global nomads, if you will, digital nomads, living in Bali or Phuket or other kinds of places, but also Phnom Penh, and in the Ho Chi Minh City, and of course, Kuala Lumpur and Bangkok for sure. So yes, in Asia, cities have been large and small, have been magnets for Asians and for expats. Who've been looking for opportunities to live cost effectively, to be entrepreneurial. So I think that that has probably led to some shifts in immigration policies. Just look right now at what's been happening post-COVID. Because Asian countries, to a large degree, have done a decent job or a good job of overcoming COVID, that's meant that they're now offering these residency visas, these long-term visit visas, these kinds of things, and there's been a strong uptake from countries around the world to live in Thailand or other countries in the region. So I think that again, part of this resorting globally, if you will, is also a competitive dynamic, right? Saying come and be here. We need to stimulate our economies in the short term, but as when you study the history of migration, you see that short term becomes long term very, very quickly and inadvertently, accidentally almost. And so you can actually see that unfolding now. When a retiree, and let's not talk only about young people, older people are also on the move. I've actually been doing a lot of research on international migration by age. And old people are as mercenary, or more mercenary than you think they would be. Right, you're seeing older people buying that one-way ticket. So North Americans going to Central America or the Caribbean, and so forth. Northern Europeans going to Southern Europe, and so on. So I think that in a way, even though much of our global narrative today is dominated by these memes around xenophobia and populism and borders going up, at the same time, there's no denying that we actually have a war for talent and for investors going on.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think we're in the era of what some call the 100-year life. And in a sense, while we're so focused on the present with the pandemic, in reality, it's probably accelerated, R&D and all kinds of resources being poured into medical science. And we've also seen a return of practices like mindfulness and just a focus on health. So out of this, I suppose one of the big silver lining is that we will be living longer lives. We will have more understanding of life itself. And I almost wonder if, the path to recovery for some has been reasonably quick. China, ironically, has actually bounced back pretty well. And you've studied China a lot within your study of Asia generally. And so where do you see the role of China with specific context to sustainable urbanization? You said that should be our number one priority. And do you think there are lessons to be learned for the world from China? And if so, how can we bring the world closer to China and China's cities and the lessons that are there, perhaps?
You may have seen the headline in the last couple of weeks that, and I'm interested to learn more about the following, which is that China is building these cities that are meant to be totally self-sufficient, right? So in order to be able to isolate healthy people in the event of the next pandemic, but also that means sustainable food supply and, recycling, upcycling of materials and, circularity and so on. Again, that has been happening in quite a few places. When I started to look at which cities are doing the most with the hydroponic and aquaponic technologies, urban farming and so on, there are leading examples in North America, in Europe, and in Asia, right? And there's companies catering to this industry and really innovating. So China, is one of them. So China is one of the largest now, sort of in terms of its acreage or square meters of space devoted to aquaponic infrastructure. So entire large cavernous buildings that are now producing many hectares worth of food, of crops, not on a weekly basis, on like a daily basis, right? So China as a whole, again, when you're talking about the largest population in the world, it's also the biggest food importer in the world as well. So with China, what I've found over the years is that it's not either or, it's both and, right? On the one hand, they're still building these coal-fired power plants. On the other hand, they're building, nuclear reactors as well, and have made huge investments in renewable energy and dominate the global solar market as well, and obviously want to take over the global electric car market too. So you get both and at the same time. So, there are these, even if, the method of China's economic rise is import substitution and, sort of these trade practices that have undermined, incumbents in industries very rapidly. Some of these technologies, though, are going to be critical for helping poorer countries, ideally sort of leapfrog to some degree. So, electric vehicles and solar power and nuclear and things like this. So we have to think about China's, sort of engagement with the world not in a binary way, not in terms of China is the rising superpower, and historically there's conflict between an incumbent superpower and a rising superpower. Therefore, China, it's an all or nothing proposition, because it's not. Right, China is very deeply engaged already in the world, everywhere in the world. Just look at infrastructure finance, right? Most infrastructure projects are not green, they're not sustainable. Neither are China's. However, that process of infrastructure finance and what they are now trying to call the Green Belt and Road. There's projects around Eurasia that China is involved in which you will have long-range power transmission from renewable sources like solar farms and things like this, wind farms. That's an example of how China can help poorer countries with large populations that are rapidly modernizing, but maybe keep their emissions under control. So I think that there's, again, as with any great power, positives and negatives.
That's actually quite a bright picture, at least the way I interpret it. And almost makes me ask the question, I don't think that this pandemic has in any way resulted in the end of globalization. I think we're going to see a fresh take on that. And of course, global cities have been in the popular imagination. And when you think of that, the first thing that comes to mind is a global financial center. That seems to be the driver of global cities. But is that going to be the case moving forward? And do you think there are alternatives to being a GFC for global cities, and what those might be?
It's a great question. So depending on how you rank what a global city is, it cannot be just its population. It's also its gravity. And I think these are measured, this issue is discussed more in terms of gravity than demographic size or geographic size. And what do I mean by gravity? Well, how significant is the city as a financial center, as a trading hub, as a conduit for data flows or for airline passengers and travel? These are some of the ways in which we measure the centrality. And if we use that metric, there are only about 7 or 8 global cities, the usual suspects, if you will. So can there be a city that's really a global city and has that gravity, but not necessarily because it's made itself a center for global financial markets? It's possible. I mean, you could imagine an Istanbul of the future, being like that potentially. You could actually imagine a totally different Moscow being like that, because you can imagine a future Russia that is not xenophobic, because of course no country has a more rapidly declining population than Russia, so eventually things may change. Canada is an example. Canada's not, Toronto is certainly a very important city in the world, but it's not one of the most significant global financial centers in terms of global capital markets. But Canada has the most expansive immigration policy in the entire world, by far, in the world today. So that means that, Canada has a really, bright future demographically, and Toronto and Vancouver and, Montreal are going to have a different complexion in demographics. It's not going to matter as much whether or not they are global financial centers by a technical definition of the market capitalization of their stock exchange. The fact is they're going to become ever more significant places of urban experimentation and of constructing ever greater cities in size and in hopefully quality of services and as role models for other places in the world as they evolve.
I'm starting to see a vision of a very exciting network of global city labs as you're painting a picture with, I think these are great bright spots, and I think that's possible. You talked a lot about diplomacy
Diplomacity.
Diplomacity,
Yeah.
absolutely, and diplomacy of cities. I think that's actually, we're living in an age where we need more diplomacity. And I wonder if you can share with us your thoughts on the role of city networks. We're in Singapore, one of the great cities which is pushing ahead with networks like the World Mayors Forum. What's your thought on that? And specifically, if you want to share your thought on Singapore as well in terms of how it can be driving, what kind of city networks?
Well, what's so interesting about Singapore, as everyone knows, it's a city-state island, right? And in that sense, you know, there is not a hinterland, and that's always been considered a great risk, right? You know, it's a small country, it's a price taker in geopolitics and the world economy and setting the rules of the game. On the other hand, with a limited population, you know, it can be more nimble, less people to have to, you know, care for, so to speak. It can be more decisive as an actor. And that decisiveness is certainly one of the key characteristics of effective cities. You know, one of the things we were talking about earlier was the 15-minute city and this idea of the sort of 5-block radius. So city mayors are empowered now to say, we have to think about a work from home situation. We have to think about having the amenities and essential services, whether it is hospitals, food supply, parks and green space, for our citizens in a walkable way. And again, they were thinking about this before the pandemic, but it's in the cities where you're going to see, you know, the mayors who take charge and say, this is our new priority. We're shifting our budgetary allocation. We're going to get this done within the next, you know, few years. Right? And that, I think, is really powerful. So you can much better imagine an entire city government or city, you know, municipality, or in the case of Singapore, a country, being able to say, we need to have broadband, everyone needs to have fiber in their home as soon as possible. You know, they actually already did that, more or less. Other places are going to want to do that too. It's going to change, again, you know, the designation of land for green space. The balance, very importantly, between commercial and residential real estate, right, is also going to change. So you can't expect a far-off capital, you know, to make this decision for a big, the city has to do it. And that's the moment that we're in. But of course, as you know, we can't generalize about what cities are going to get that right and what cities aren't. And some of the cities that you and I know quite well, like say New Delhi, you know, for a few year period, things are going right. And then things change, and it depends on politics and administration and priorities and so on. So, you know, that's why the diplomacity is so important, right? You have to lock in the learning so that you have an ongoing process of positive change, irrespective of who's in charge.
Let's stay with this topic. It's very exciting to talk about this, not least because this is ultimately about how people interact and connect, and you also talked about city networks going back a long time. So I wonder if there's such a thing as citizen diplomacy, and if you do think that citizens have a role in forming almost diplomatic networks across cities, how do you do this in today's day and age?
Well, that actually has a very rich history. You know, the sister city networks, by the way, have been important, you know, communication channels across very hard boundaries, you know, even during the Cold War, for example. It's actually part of how China emerged over the last 40 years, is Chinese sister city networks with Western cities. And that's been important too, and it's just increased mutual, you know, understanding to some degree. But citizen diplomacy, you know, happens in many ways, and you know, we can actually measure this in the sense that you could look at the number of tourists and how long they spend in another place and how much immersion is going on, and you know, the pairs of countries and the bonds that are built as they increase their tourism with each other. But students, going back to your earlier question, are one of the most robust. There are 5 million international students any given year in the world, and there's actually a competition to really capture those students. And if, by definition, what I mean, of course, is someone going to study outside of their country. So that is, you know, to some degree also this sort of citizen diplomacy. We see it in business all the time. Asia is the geography, the locus of most of the world's most significant and potentially violent geopolitical confrontations. And any number of them would have broken out by now were it not for the role of private citizen diplomats, if you will, which is to say corporate executives calling up their leaders and saying, no, you're not going to fight over that because we have an enormous amount of cross-border trade and foreign investment with that country, right? And I absolutely assure you that is what has been happening. That is why, one of the major reasons why we have peace in Asia right now. It is not enough to guarantee lasting stability. Otherwise, the situations in Taiwan or South China Sea and other disputes would already have been resolved. But it's certainly important.
I think that's great. I think we're almost at the end of this conversation. It's always fascinating to have conversations with you because you bring such a rich perspective to any conversation and discussion on cities, or for that matter, any topic. I want to talk a little bit more about taking cue from citizen diplomacy. Our kids are growing up, they're in school today, they're going through a time like no other. And I think it's going to be an exciting time, of course, in the future. But if you were to imagine your kids growing up as they are in their teens and in their 20s.
They almost are.
Exactly.
Scary.
Well, I almost wonder if you've traveled a lot during your university and earlier days, you come from a diplomatic family. I almost wonder if our kids need a core curriculum of traveling to maybe 5 cities in the world to really learn about it. Is that something that you can imagine happening?
If only, let's start, but not dwell. But I mean, on a sad note. Many of the school-age children in the world today are not in school, because of COVID. So books and pencils, literacy, an internet connection. These are the things that they need, and travel obviously in a very 21st century technological way now begins just by surfing the internet and learning about places. And that's better than nothing, when you're thinking about all of the people who don't have the luxury and the opportunity to travel. When you're in a city like Singapore, London, and so forth, then it's more natural and kids have that opportunity. And of course, they grow up to be more sort of global citizens. But what I am noticing, and this is, again, measurable, the number of school curricula that are including things like global studies as a subject matter, starting in primary school, has been rising. The number of schools adopting the International Baccalaureate curriculum, the IB curriculum, has been rising. The number of IB schools has been proliferating, let alone those that are just shifting to that curriculum. So there is a clear generational change, awakening. It's coming from top down and bottom up at the same time. And I think that's very, very promising. And there is actually a lot of data on this, a lot of research on this, a lot of very good educational institutions that are part of the driver for why this is happening. So I don't really worry about the next generation being sort of inherently globalist and finding a balance psychologically between patriotism and globalism. I think that's a problem that we have right now. It's honestly not a problem I worry too much about in the future when I look at survey data of young people and some of the obviously common global challenges like climate change and so forth that young people prioritize inherently more so than they think about national rivalries. So I think the mindset is there, and I think obviously we should, in public policy and global policy, it's a very important and underutilized kind of motivation to take the shadow of the future, to act with the next generation in mind, to give the next generation a voice. But I think a lot more of that could be useful right now.
Thank you, Parag. This has been an invigorating conversation and I think one that inspires. And I'm very fortunate to have had it today with you. Thank you so much. And it was great traveling the world with World City. This is the way we roll now. So thank you so much.
Thank you.